It is actually 3 a.m. in the morning in Sydney. I'm telling you this because I flew in yesterday, so I'm still on the Sydney time zone, so if my brain is a little slow today, just excuse me. Anyway, let's get started. We're not going to talk about testing. That was just a lure. I'm not going to talk about testing at all. I'm going to talk about much cooler stuff. First, I'm going to talk about myself, but that won't take very long. My name's John Smart. I do a lot of work in technical agile practices. Cool stuff like behaviour driven development, test driven development, continuous delivery, and a whole lot of other interesting areas. And there are a couple of books. But today I'm going to be focusing on a technique that I think you all know off by heart. It's called behaviour driven development. Can I have a show of hands who knows behaviour driven development really, really, really well? That put a bit of a damper on it, didn't it? Who knows behaviour driven development at all? Yep, so you've all got a basic understanding of what behaviour driven development is? It's just using Cucumber, isn't it? Yeah? So behaviour driven development is when you write your automated tests in Cucumber. Okay, we're good. You can all go home. Okay, there might be a little bit more to it than that. So you saw this guy this morning, Dan North. He was the guy who invented this weird and wonderful concept called behaviour-driven development quite a while back, actually, about 8 or so years back at least, 8, 9 years. And he summed it up recently saying something along these lines. So I won't bother you with the details, but essentially it's a technique that uses examples to build up a shared understanding and to surface areas of uncertainty, so that's important, uncertainty, doubt, and misunderstanding, to deliver software that matters. That's important as well. So behaviour-driven development is a whole lot of practices that orient around, circle around this idea. First of all, it's a behaviour-driven development is actually a collaboration technique. It's not really a test automation practice. It's not something that testers do, which is why the testing in the title is a little bit of a lure. It's actually a collaboration technique, a little bit like agile practices like Scrum and so forth, bring people together and get them working in a more effective way. The same thing with behaviour-driven development. It's a way of getting people to communicate more effectively. It's a way of helping people identify the value in what they're building, because it's very easy when you're writing software to lose focus on what you're actually trying to achieve, to not see the forest for the trees, so to speak, and build some really cool stuff that's of very little use to anyone. But it's cool, shiny, works well, but no use to the customer, so it's got no end value. That's a bit of a shame. You could be on the beach. No, you're in the UK. You could be, I don't know, shopping in London. What do you do in the UK? You don't go to the pub. You could be in the pub, that's right, rather than writing lines of code for customers that don't actually use the lines of code. Yeah? So there is an aspect of automation, very strong aspect of automation, but I tend to de-emphasize it, even though I really like the tools, and I spend a lot of time with the tools. I de-emphasize the automation intentionally because I don't want that to be the primary idea. It's not the primary focus of behaviour-driven development, but it's what lets you apply behaviour-driven development really effectively when you do it right. Another misconception about behaviour-driven development is that it's just at the requirements level, just at the acceptance tests. And then you do TDD at the low level, yeah? Yeah? Yes? No? Maybe? Rubbish? Am I talking rubbish? You're allowed to say I'm talking rubbish, because I just was there. TDD and BDD are closely related, and BDD also applies at the TDD level, which is because you want to build software that actually delivers value, but you also want to make it work, just as sort of side thing. So you can be at the pub instead of coming back at midnight to fix your bugs, which is kind of annoying. And another area which is really important is this concept of living documentation, which I'm finding a lot more interest in recently. People are getting interested in this area. The idea that you can use your acceptance criteria more than just as a set of test reports, but as a way of actually documenting what you've done and what you haven't done in your application, what your application does and what it doesn't do, and what it was planned to do, what it was meant to do, in a very descriptive, readable way, and show that to the business. So in a nutshell, this is your traditional development. I'll take a bit of a survey later on, but this is your traditional development process. You get your BA who talks to the business owner, comes up with a nice detailed spec. So this also works in Agile because this thing can be user stories. Still get your BA talking to the business and coming up with user stories. Then the BA tells the developer to go build stuff. You, developer, work. And the developer builds stuff, translates effectively the requirements into code. And at the same time, the tester goes and translates the requirements into test cases. Yeah? Does this ring any bells, this process? And then if it's a product, maybe you need to have someone translate what was actually produced into documentation. And eventually it'll get to the customer, hopefully. But the problem with this approach is that there are lots of places where things can go wrong, that you can get miscommunications and misunderstandings. Does this represent the way people here have experienced development projects? Yes? Hands up. Hands up who's... Yeah? So it is actually quite common. Who's experienced this approach even in Agile projects? Yeah? Yes, I've seen that a lot. I've seen Agile. We do Agile, but here's your 50-page Word document with the specifications. Or even if this approach with stories. Here we're doing Agile, but I'm the BA and I'm going to give you all these stories that I've written. Yes, the stories are 20 pages long each, but they're stories because they've got story at the top of them. But yeah, so it is a fairly common approach. And what behaviour-driven development does, when you're doing behaviour-driven development well, teams that do it well, end up doing something along these lines. It's not always exactly this, but roughly along these lines. You have a conversation with the business owner. Sometimes the business owner is actually in the team, sometimes not. It depends on your team. And then what happens, the interesting bit, is rather than the BA going and writing stories, the BA, developers, testers, I call this the three amigos, where 3 is a number between 3 and 7, because you can have quite a few people here. You can get the product owner involved, you can have the whole team sometimes, but you get a certain number of people involved, at least a tester and a developer and a BA, together to actually clarify what is supposed to be being built, what's meant to be built and why it's being built, what the value is of the feature that you're trying to propose. And out of this you get these, what we call executable requirements. So you'll come up with your cucumber or your JBehave scenarios. And that's actually executable. The developers can take that and run with it. And you'll also have a discussion between developers, testers, about which features or which aspects, which acceptance criteria can be tested automatically and which ones would be more subject to manual testing and what can be left for exploratory testing. So it's all about this collaboration idea. And from there, you get your code, you get living documentation. So living documentation tells you with very little doubt what's actually being built because it's depending on the automated acceptance tests, which tie back to the acceptance criteria. Do they work or don't they? You can't really have your 90% done. So the big difference here between a traditional approach is that your specifications or your requirements are designed and developed collaboratively together as a team. And why is that interesting? Why is that useful? Because it flushes out assumptions, it flushes out misunderstandings, and it identifies areas of uncertainty that you might want to investigate or that you hadn't thought of. And you'd rather spot those areas of uncertainty early rather than later. Who is using an approach like this? Who's using a sort of vague variation on an approach like this? Well, you come and talk to me about the vague variation on the approach later on. I'm quite curious. But anyway, there are variations. I mean, it's a general approach. The main key there is the collaboration side of it. And why are we collaborating? Because we're trying to make software that matters, to make software as value. Who's heard Goiko, been in one of Goiko's talks? Yeah, Goico does a lot on this sort of area. Building software that matters, building features that actually have value. Because when you build software, there are only two problems in software development. It's building the right software and building software right. If you can solve those two problems, you're good. You can go to the pub. On the first side, you've got to build, if you build something right, you build it well, you build it in a way that's highly maintainable, that's all good. But if you don't, at the same time, build the right thing, then you're solving the wrong problem. So you might be solving the wrong problem well. On the other axis, you might be solving the right problem, but not doing all the correct practices. And in that case, well, you'll be solving the right problem, but poorly, so it'll be very expensive or hard to maintain. Of course, you also get this bit down the bottom where you effectively are neither solving the problem nor doing it right, so you're basically building useless crap. And what you want is something up here where you have, sorry, next slide, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Here. Something that actually does what the business wants and is maintainable, easy to change, bug-free. That's what we're trying to aim for, and that's what one of the practices in behaviour-driven development are all about, combining those two aspects of building something that's useful and also building something that actually works well. And on that first aspect, building something that's useful, at the end of the day, unless you're working for government, it's all about delivering value. I'm quite serious in unless you're working for government. I do a lot of work for government organisations, and they have quite slightly different value propositions, which are perfectly reasonable. I'm not joking, they're perfectly reasonable in the context. But in a profit-based organisation, it's all about either increasing revenue or decreasing costs, or protecting revenue, or avoiding future costs. So it all comes down to revenue one way or another, revenue or costs. And so one of the big discussions that you want to have about any feature that you propose is, where does the money come from? What's the value proposition? And that often is okay at the business level, but tends to get dissipated and diluted and forgotten by the time to get to us developers. Would that reflect your project teams? Often you'll get developers who won't actually have been told why they're actually building features in business terms. So in behaviour-driven development, we try and sort of alleviate that problem by making the business goals very, very obvious. So we'll try and highlight what the business goals that we're trying to achieve actually are. And from those business goals, we'll try and identify what features will actually contribute to those business goals. So this is standard Agile backlog grooming process in a lot of ways, but it's very much more focused on delivering business goals and also reducing the risk that you may not achieve your business goals. So behaviour-driven development has a number of techniques that can help you in that area, because not all features are equal in terms of how they deliver business goals. Here we have, what do we have here? Earning frequent flyer from points or view frequent flyer balance online. They may not be of equal value. If you're implementing a frequent flyer website, they might not be of the same priority. You've got to talk through that with the business to understand which features actually have the highest priority. Which features are going to actually deliver the value. Are there assumptions about why they deliver that value? Are those assumptions valid? And all that comes from conversation. The conversations give you that understanding. Written documents are very hard, obviously, to convey that information, but the conversations can help. And the conversations in a behaviour-driven development context are all about examples. They're built around examples. Because as humans, we work better with concrete examples, it turns out, than with more abstract propositions or theories or ideas or concepts. It's much easier to relate to if I give you a phrase like, a new frequent flyer starts off with a bronze status. You might come back with But what if marketing proposes a special deal where they can start off with silver? What if they get transferred from another program? Are there cases where this won't be the case? You'll be thinking of counterexamples that might change effectively the outcome. And it's that sort of conversation which helps you understand the problem domain that you're trying to solve. And there are other techniques. So this is a technique that Gojko Adzika's been promoting called impact mapping, which helps you basically take a set of features and map it back to the original business value, or conversely take a goal and flush out the features that are going to be interesting for that to deliver that goal, and figure out exactly how they will deliver that goal. So they're all interesting techniques, and they're all part of the broad BDD context. And one of the things that this whole idea of conversation is trying to flush out is the idea of uncertainty. So that's typically how a project works, yeah? This is on one axis you've got basically how much you understand, and then you've got time. So start off, you do your analysis, and your understanding of the project builds up pretty straight. Then maybe it'll flatten out a bit. By pretty early on, you pretty much know everything about the project, and from there on it's smooth sailing. You don't get any surprises, yeah? Yeah, that's how it works, okay. No? Did I hear a no? So, yeah, what really happens is more something like this, if you're lucky. So you're basically, if you think not in terms of knowledge but in ignorance, you can say that your ignorance about the problem domain decreases over time. And the time that you know the most about the project and you'd be best placed to actually implement the project is right at the end. So this idea that your knowledge about the project increases at random variable rates, because there are always surprises, always stuff. One thing that you can be sure of is there's stuff that you don't know. There's always going to be stuff that comes up around the bite. It might be a technical issue, it might be a requirements issue that you didn't understand. Could be a feature that the business neglected to mention but changes your whole architecture. And there are some things you can't really cater for because it will just blindside you, come out of the blue. But there are others where you can actually try to investigate and reduce your amount of uncertainty. So one of the things we try and do is when we're choosing what features we want to deliver, we're not only going to try and deliver features that deliver value, but also deliver features that allow us to investigate areas that we're uncertain about, areas that we think there is risk. Everyone with me so far? Yeah? And I keep coming back to this. It all comes back to conversation. Conversation is what enables you to keep that thread going, to keep that understanding of what you're trying to build. And this is a quote from Liz Keogh, another Brit. Brits do a lot of work on BDD apparently. Anyway, so what Liz says is that having the conversation is more important than recording the conversation, which is more important than automating the conversation. So what she means by that is there's no point automating an acceptance criteria if you're not sure about whether it's actually valid acceptance criteria, if you're just making it up. If you're not having the conversation to be sure that an acceptance criteria reflects what the business actually needs, then there's no point automating it. You need to build up that understanding before you go away and automate it. So that understanding is really important, which is where we get this idea of what the testers do. So I have seen, I don't know whether it's the case I've seen places, because I come into a lot of organisations to help them out implementing behaviour driven development. And they say, yeah, we're doing BDD. Joe over there, he's a tester. He writes all the tests in Cucumber. We're doing BDD. No one's in that situation, I hope. Anyone? Yeah? So I won't say that's bad as such, because it actually can be a very useful technique at times, but you're effectively retro-documenting your application from a functional perspective. It's not BDD as such, it's writing automated tests using a BDD tool, which can be useful. It can be useful for legacy applications. But it's not BDD as such. What happens in a lot of projects that I've seen is this sort of situation where you have developer delivers working code, except it's not really all that working code because there are bugs in it, so the tester tests it and then reports back to the developer who fixes them and so forth. So what, in a BDD context, is what we want to do is eliminate this waste, which is the feedback loop between the developer and the tester. I remember back when I started in IT, a long time ago, I once was talking to a test manager, and the test manager says, sure, yeah, we have test plans. We write the test plans based on the requirements. It wasn't that long ago, actually, but anyway. And I said, well, do you show the test plans to the developers? Oh, no. We wouldn't want to do that. We want to keep the surprise. So the test plans were sort of like an exam. So what we want to do is avoid that sort of situation, which was a little bit extreme, but anyway, and use this collaborative approach, which you'll often hear the three amigos referred to it for this approach, where you get everyone collaborating and then you come up with both working code and working acceptance criteria. So your Cucumber or your JBehave comes out of this first meeting. You don't go out of that meeting without executable acceptance criteria. That's important. If you just have a meeting to say, okay, this is what we should do here, the acceptance criteria, we'll just jot them down on a bit of paper and then go off and actually implement them afterwards, you lose a lot of the information. It's not as effective. So you actually want your automated acceptance criteria. I find it's more effective that they actually come out of this meeting. And then all your tester has to do is do the exploratory testing. I wouldn't say all the tester has to do. The tester will do more than that, but it allows the tester to focus on more intelligent testing. So the way this works is your tester, your developer, your BA, and they're coming up with these acceptance criteria that you can then automate. Now the difference between your acceptance criteria that you might come up with when you just do a first pass on a story and the actual given when then is important. So this, just emphasising, this is what you're automating. This is what's coming out of your three-way handshake or three amigos or whatever you want to call it. This is what actually comes out of it. If that's not coming out of it, it's less effective because someone has to do these, but by the time you get round to implementing the earning points from standard flights and actually going automating it, it will end up being the tester at the end of the cycle. And so you lose that collaborative aspect. The developers can't benefit from these acceptance criteria driving their development process, and it just becomes automated regression tests using a BDD tool, which is a bit of a shame. So, how do we get to these given when thens, these acceptance criteria? Basically what we're doing, we're exploring the requirements with these examples that I was talking about earlier. So it's very important that you are talking about concrete examples. The concrete examples are really the key to this. And your examples, so is everybody familiar with this sort of syntax? Yes, anyone not familiar with this syntax? Can I assume that everyone is? So if you're not familiar, this is a type of notation that we use in tools like JBehave or Cucumber or SpecFlow to represent your requirement. So it's a semi-English requirement which can be used in automated tests and wired up to test code behind the scenes. But that actually, so I've got teams where the tester will write these, or the BA even will write these, or technically everyone writes them collaboratively, but they'll take turns actually typing it into the IntelliJ or whatever they're using. So these are actually what's typed into source code. So again, it's a collaboration thing. You don't have just one person collaborating on, well, one person collaborating by themselves. That's hard. You get the whole team collaborating to come up with the examples that you want to put into these and then to formalise them. So everyone will have different feedback. Testers will have very interesting ideas on edge cases, corner cases, error conditions. Developers will have feedback on how you're actually going to implement those tests. Who thinks acceptance tests? I hope the answer is no one, but who thinks that all these acceptance tests will be web tests if you've got a web application? No one? Yes? So in fact, when you automate tests, typically one of the first questions, how are you going to test it? And the answer is, if you ask the testers, they'll say, well, I'll test it the same way as I would if I was doing it manually. I'll open the application, I'll log on, and I'll step through the screens and so forth. And that is not always the right answer, because that, if you're trying to implement continuous delivery, that will slow down your build cycle. That will slow down your automated tests a lot. You want to try and do as many tests as you can without going through the UI, so that you can have a reasonably fast set of acceptance tests, and only test the UI for things that are actually related to the UI, which there are plenty. If you're testing an AngularJS app, there are plenty of things you're going to need to test through the UI. But there's also a lot of things that you will be able to test directly against your web services or your back-end services or whatever architecture you're using. And that's where the developers will have a lot of input. So, implementing these acceptance tests, I said the implementation is sort of last on the list. It's not the most important thing. It's just implementing the automated acceptance criteria is only effective if you're implementing the right thing. If you're implementing acceptance criteria that will give good feedback, that will provide fast feedback, that will provide relevant feedback, that will not be too expensive to write, and that will not be too expensive to maintain. If the cost of your automated acceptance tests is greater than the value you're getting from the feedback, then there is no point having that acceptance test. You might as well do it manually. So I don't say that lightly. Your tests need to be easy to write and easy to maintain, or it will drain. Some teams use really heavyweight commercial testing tools where this is pretty much the standard way of doing things, that you will have to re-record all of your tests. Not naming any tools, but I think you know the ones I mean, where you have to re-record virtually your test suites for every release, which kind of defeats the point of automation. But that's not what you want. A test suite that is very low maintenance. It's easy to maintain. And there are a couple of tricks to doing this. Here's one of them. Go.
For your information, there's a lot more to ogres than people think.
Example?
Example? Okay, ogres are like onions.
They stink?
Yes. No.
Oh, they make you cry?
No.
Oh, you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hairs.
No. Layers. Onions have layers. Ogres have layers. Onions have layers. You get it. We both have layers.
Oh, you both have layers. Oh. You know, not everybody likes onions.
Yeah, so automated acceptance tests are like onions and like ogres. They have layers. Layers are really important if you want to write acceptance tests, and this applies to both web tests and non-web tests. Doesn't matter what sort of acceptance test you're writing, the layers are really important. This is a fairly common approach where you have 3 or 4 major layers. You'll have your business rules at the top level. This is typically, if you're using Cucumber or JBehave, this is the steps inside your given when then scenario files, feature files. Now this should not be given I enter secret in the password field and I click on the login button. This should be really high level business flow. Shouldn't be more than, I don't know, 6, 7 maximum lines in this sort of scenario, unless there's a really good reason. It should be very high level. Then as you drill down, you get a layer which I call the business flow layer, which is how is this business goal achieved? So in this case, it's very simple, traveller searches for flights. But in more complicated scenarios, you might have things like when you're processing a particular type of file, the file should be sent to this particular server, there should be an event logged in the database, and there should be some other sort of event sent somewhere else. I'm randomly making examples, but you get the idea. You may have fairly complicated business flows at this level that you need to implement. So you may have several steps inside each step here. But you're still at the business flow, you're still at the business level. We're not actually talking about anything technical yet. At the next layer down, so this is an example as a web test, and we're using the page objects model to hide away the details about the web page inside a particular class. So here we've got a page object, but it doesn't have to be. This applies for web tests and non-web tests. That component could be talking to a web service, or it could be talking to a mainframe, or it could be talking to some sort of back-end service. The point is you're talking to it in business terms, and then inside that class you're going to actually do the nitty-gritty details about what you actually have to implement. So that layering is really important. Excuse me. If you can get that layering right, it will go a long way both to making your tests easier to understand, easier to maintain, and also easier to reuse, because you end up with libraries of methods that you can reuse between different tests. Another trick, which is, we've already talked about the collaboration aspect of this. This also applies in the implementation. Another trick is to get people to work together. So when I say work together, get the testers pairing with the developers on the automated acceptance criteria. So get testers and developers actually working together to implement the code. I find that works really well. Also, that means the developers will be more motivated to factor in testability into the design, because that's really important too. It's nothing more irritating than testing a web application and wanting to identify a table, for example, on a page, but not having an ID on the table. So you have to use some ugly XPath or CSS hack. And that is because it wasn't factored into the testability. Or that you can't access a back-end server, so you have to go through the UI because there's no web service to access a particular piece of functionality that you'd like to test. If you think of those things up front, or if the developers and testers pair on it, it's going to be much easier to make more reproducible, more refactorable, and more reusable tests. This is a real example. This is one of the organisations who said, yeah, we're doing BDD, our tester writes the tests in Cucumber, or JBehave, I think in this example, but same thing. You want to make sure your tests focus on business value. Business value is relatively stable. If the business proposition of a feature changes, then that's a major change. If the way a screen works changes, that's not a major change. Your acceptance criteria should only need to change at the high level when a major change happens. So that's kind of the reaction I had when I saw this. And we worked through that and we kind of refactored it into something like that. And it ends up as a very simple requirement about updating details about buses registered in a system. Not particularly complicated, but there's a lot of implementation detail in this first version, whereas the second version is describing the intent of what you're trying to do as opposed to describing how you do it. So your acceptance criteria should be focusing on the what, not on the how. That's really important too. Another aspect is that your acceptance criteria are living documentation. They are documentation about what your system does, so they should be written in a way that the business can look at and say, yes, I understand, that's what I want. And not just sign on the dotted line and then say, no, that wasn't what I wanted at all. So it needs to be written in a way that it's clear enough that everybody understands, and written in a way so that you can report on it and publish where you're at very easily. So different organisations I've worked with do this in different ways, but typically you will try and generate excuse me, living documentation out of these reports. And the standard Cucumber JBehave reports are pretty crap. So usually you have to go and do something a little bit more sophisticated. But if you do it properly, you can come up with reports like this, where you're illustrating what the features do and giving the testers a starting point for what they actually test. So they can look at the automated tests, look at maybe if it's a web application, they'll have screenshots or video recordings about how the acceptance criteria was verified, or checking the business rules. It can even be used for as a starting point for technical documentation. So describing, okay, you want to log on or you want to register a new client, here's how you do it. Here's a step-by-step illustration of how it's done. But it also, if you take a step back, an application is more than just a set of stories. Stories are pretty much throwaway things. Users don't care about stories. Users don't really care what bits of Lego you use to put your application together, as long as they get the application they want at the end of the day. Stories are just temporary planning artifacts. What users are really interested in is features. Features are typically at a higher level than stories. You typically need several stories to deliver a feature which is of value. So your living documentation needs to be able to cater for this. It needs to be able to aggregate the report so that you get a summary of what your application is actually, where it's at, what your project has built, what features, what capabilities have been delivered, what haven't been delivered, and what's in progress. So a test report will tell us what tests run, what tests haven't run, what tests have failed. That's what a test report does. That's what test reports are very good at that, yeah? What tests were run and what's missing from this picture. Requirements. What happens if there are no tests for a particular requirement? You're all green, you're good to go, but there are some features which have no acceptance criteria implemented at all. So if you want to use living documentation as a reporting tool, you need not only to know what tests were executed, you also need to know what tests were not executed and what requirements were not executed, what requirements were not tested. Excuse me, I'm just going to find some water somewhere. Water. So the requirements, living documentation needs to report not only what was tested, but what wasn't tested. So that's where we have this idea of feature coverage, where you're reporting not only the requirements that have been implemented, but also what requirements have not been implemented. So you need your living documentation to talk to Rally or Jira or whatever software you're using to manage your requirements and say, hey, here's a whole lot of requirements which have not been tested. Have I got a slide for this? I have. You'll see it. I'm slightly out of order. Anyway, but the important thing is the living documentation is way more than just what tests were executed and what tests weren't. You can also, so here's just a few examples of some living documentation. You'll have these on the slides. But the key message here is that you're leaving documentation, you need to adapt it to your own requirements, and typically the reporting that comes out of the box with tools like Cucumber or JBehave or SpecFlow are quite limited, and if you want to use it seriously, you'll need to roll your own or use some tools on top of the standard BDD tools to get something interesting out of it. Here's the slide I was referring to. So feature coverage, what I call feature coverage, tells you what requirements were tested and what requirements weren't tested, which is a lot more useful than simply knowing what tests were executed and what tests weren't executed. So what I'll run through here is just a few quick gotchas before we have, I'll try and leave a bit of time for questions. A few gotchas that I've come across. So the first one is when the business analyst writes the scenarios, writes the given when and thens, and then gets them validated by the developers. Anyone had seen that? It can work, but the problem is validating a document, reviewing a document is not the same as collaboratively writing the document. It's basically putting a stamp of approval on it, so you'll skim over it and say, yeah, that looks about right, but it's nothing very different from actually collaborating and saying, are you sure you thought of that? Or how about we try this example? And working through examples to try and make sure you've understood all the nooks and crannies. So I found this approach, there are teams that do it, but I found it's not a particularly effective approach. On the other end of the scale, it's what we were talking about earlier, the tester uses BDD tools to write the acceptance tests. But like I said, this is kind of less effective than the previous scenario because the developer doesn't get any benefit at all out of this approach. So it's effectively just using Cucumber as a test automation tool, which is losing a lot of the leverage. I've seen situations where in the 3 Amigos session, you'll have whole features which are thrown out the door because talking through them, you realise that there's a much simpler way of implementing what was requested. Anyone come across that scenario, that sort of thing? Just by talking about a feature, say, hey, wait a minute, couldn't we, this notification thing, we need a full long workflow, couldn't we just send an email? Oh, yeah, didn't think of that. Half an hour of coding later and your feature's done. So that's what happens when you get the collaboration. If you're just doing BDD as a test automation technique, I'm not saying this is bad. There are scenarios where this works quite well, but it is not BDD as such. It doesn't get that collaborative aspect, and you don't leverage you don't get the leverage that you do out of the collaborative BDD approach. Another anti-pattern that I've come across is when the 3 Amigos session doesn't actually produce any acceptance criteria or doesn't produce executable acceptance criteria, then the developer goes and writes the acceptance criteria afterward, developer or tester. So again, what that ends up doing is the developer will end up inventing some acceptance criteria without that collaboration. So again, it's not all black and white. There are situations where each can work, but I find it's less effective because, again, you don't get the collaboration. And my personal favourite, I've seen whole sprints fail because of this one. You get scenarios like this. Anyone seen scenarios along these lines? In your own work? You get scenarios which are way too UI-centric because they're coming from a tester's perspective. So when scenarios are UI-centric, you tend to lose focus on the actual business proposition of the feature, which is bad. Because it means you can develop a whole you can develop typically a whole sprint worth of work, fulfill all the acceptance criteria, deliver something, and then realise that the user doesn't actually need it or wants something else. So I'll wrap up now. I'll go straight to the questions section because the rest is on the slides and pretty uninteresting. So I think we have 5 minutes left, so I can open the floor to questions. Yes? So the first question was, can you do performance testing with BDD? Absolutely yes, and it's a really cool technique to do. I've seen Cucumber used with, was it Gatling or Grinder, one of the two, where you actually describe your acceptance criteria, your performance acceptance criteria, using Gherkin type syntax. So given there are so many users and there are so many transactions per second, then the average response time should be between less than 5 seconds and so forth. So you express your acceptance criteria in that format, and then how you automate the Cucumber or JBehave is easy. You just wire it up. So you can automate pretty much anything behind the scenes. But absolutely you can do that, and it is a very good way of doing it. Yeah. So the question is, should the acceptance criteria be run on the developer machines? I say yes. Acceptance criteria should be part of the source code. They're tied to a version. If you're doing continuous delivery, they will change with each version. And so absolutely they should be run on the developer machines before they get committed. In practice, if they take several hours to run, developers may not. They may commit it and then let it run on the build server. But they should be capable of running them on the on their own machines.
But if you automate gathering test with Cucumber or JDK, the test itself will be in gathering. You cannot describe what steps you execute in JDK or Cucumber. So you'll have your test split in 2 parts. The gathering will know what to test, and JDK/Cucumber will only know what to check as a result. What's the latency or...
So the question is basic.
So your test is split in 2 parts.
Yeah, so the question is...
Itself will be in gathering, and like assertion, how much time, what the maximum latency is allowed will be in JPK.
So basically the way it's about how you implement performance tests using JBehave and a tool like Gatling. I've seen it with the Grinder, or JMeter as well as another option. Or you're basically driving your I haven't done it with Gatling, but you're basically driving the tool, Gatling or JBehave or JMeter, from the JBehave or Cucumber fixture code. So it actually kicks off the test, waits for a result, and then evaluates the outcomes.
Yes, but it means the steps of the test will be in Gatling or Grinder, not in the JBK. JBK will just start the test and then assert that time wasn't exceeded.
Yeah.
And, well, you have your test split in 2 parts. You don't see what exactly you tested.
But you get the results. I mean, it's not ideal, but it gives the point of that is to be able to express the requirements. It's almost, the automation is almost icing on the cake for performance testing. What's really valuable is actually being able to narrow down those acceptance criteria in a way that can potentially be automated, which I think that's the more valuable side of it, because that actually publicises what acceptance criteria, makes people think about what the performance constraints you're trying to achieve. Any other questions? Yes, up the back. I only heard cognitive bias, to be... So would it be a good idea for developers to test his or her own work? That's probably a different question from this aspect, where the collaborative side of it is defining the acceptance criteria. So defining the examples that you'll automate and will act as the guidance. So you're actually getting several people involved in, and that's the whole point, is avoiding having just one point of view on what you should test. So you've got testers, developers, NBAs on coming up with acceptance criteria that you want to test. Then developers will fan out, expand, and test more low-level details typically. But the developers will be automating their own tests, which is a little bit different from totally writing their own acceptance criteria from scratch. Automating it is merely implementing the given when then steps. The most important part is deciding what to put in the given when thens, and that's where you collaborate. I think we're out of time. So I'll be around afterwards if you have any other questions. But yeah, thank you.
I'd like to see what's good, dressed in all your fancy clothes.